Hello. Darwinian evolutionary theory has long been the way by which we look at life in biology. Since Charles Robert Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace first printed and presented their works in 1858, their theory of evolution has since affected us in how we conduct scientific studies on life. Today, the reality of organic evolution can be denied only by abandoning reason. At the end of this lecture, you're expected to be able to define organic evolution and explain why it is a keystone to biology. You're expected to highlight some contributing ideas and persons to Darwin's theory of evolution, and to enumerate and explain the evidences to the theory of evolution, and identify the revisions of Darwin's theory of evolution, and lastly to explain the basic forces that leads to evolution. By definition, organic evolution is the process by which living organisms are changed due to genetic variations that enable members of their population to survive the changing challenges of their environment. Understanding uh, the theory of evolution is an idea that is considered a keystone to biological understanding because it unveils the reason why there is so much diversity and at the same time unity of life forms on Earth. It also helps us better understand why natural and man-made environmental changes always lead to changes in the organisms as well. For example, insecticides that we apply to mosquitoes today. For quite a few decades already, many mosquitoes that have been subjected to insecticide spraying has now re- has now shown to be resistant to these very insecticides they were killed by. And so there is insecticide resistance that have developed among mosquitoes today. And this insecticide resistance is actually an evolutionary adaptation of the mosquitoes to survive against the killing action of sprays and other chemicals that are designed to kill them. Darwin's theory of evolution has a very long history. It was not originally started by him. Works of other people gave him ideas that he pieced together in his theory of evolution. Early Greek philosophers, for example, Xenophanes and Aristotle, recognized fossils as evidences of former life forms. Archbishop Usher declared 4004 BC as the date of life's creation. There was also George Louis Buffon, who attributed environmental influence on the modification of animal form. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was the first to present a scientific evolutionary theory, the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, which was of course later debunked. There was Charles Lyell on his theory of uniformitarianism, who he argued that the formation of Earth's crust took place through countless small changes occurring over vast periods of time, all according to known natural laws. His uniformitarian proposal was that the forces molding the planet today have operated continuously throughout its history. There was also Thomas Malthus, who lived from 1766 to 1834. In 1798, he published The Principle of Population, where he made the observations that human race would be likely to overproduce if the population size was not kept under control. Darwin's most important motivation, however, to write about his evolutionary theory was his own experience, 5 years experience of observation of the natural world and his massive collections of biological specimens collected from his 5-year trip all over the world. From, as shown here, from Great Britain to South Africa, and then he crossed the Pacific to Australia, and then to Africa, and then back to South America again, and back to Great Britain, all in 5 years between 1831 to 1836. His collections were very useful to his observations on evolution. When Darwin received a copy of Alfred Russel Wallace's manuscript about the same idea on evolution, he was prompted to publish his own theory on evolution. And so their two papers were read to unresponsive audience in July 1, 1858. Nobody understood and perhaps appreciated what they were trying to say then. The following year, 1859, Darwin published his Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. It sold out the very day it came out of the press. Another major declaration or statement of Darwin's evolutionary theory is that living organisms are in perpetual change, and fossils provide the evidence to this. Fossils are remnants of past life forms in mineralized casts or living organisms impressed in stones or preserved hard parts, or whole organisms preserved in amber. In whichever form, fossils presents direct evidence of the changes that living organisms underwent through the millennia of time. Fossil records are conventionally categorized in strata or layers of rocks that represent great expanses of time, such as shown here in this figure, with the oldest time periods collectively called Precambrian, this part here, these layers, that includes Proterozoic and Archean. The Precambrian period at the bottom, and the most recent ones towards the surface. And the latest, therefore, or the most recent, is Cenozoic era. The fossil record of macroscopic organisms, especially animals, exploded near the start of the Cambrian period at the Paleozoic era, approximately about 542 million years ago. The Precambrian era contains well-preserved fossils of bacterial, algae, and cast of jellyfishes, sponge spicules, soft corals, segmented flatworms, and worm trails. Most but not all were microscopic fossils. Fossil records show that evolutionary change across the broadest scale of time happened, and fossil trends clearly demonstrate the principle of perpetual change. Trends are directional changes in the characteristic features or patterns of diversity in a group of organisms. Fossil trends clearly demonstrate Darwin's principle of perpetual change. Another major statement of Darwin's evolutionary theory was that all organisms have a common descent. Darwin proposed that all organisms descended from an ancestral form. Life's history is depicted as a branching tree called phylogenetic tree, as is shown here of the phylogenetic tree of animals. In evolution, we should be able to trace genealogies of living organisms or the modern species backward until they converge on an ancestral lineage shared with other species, both living and extinct, such as shown here by this phylogenetic tree. Darwin recognized the major source of evidence for common descent in the concept of homology. Homology refers to the organ, or rather refers to the same organ in different organisms under a variety of form and function, such as shown here in this figure, with the forelimb bones that are uh, shared by different organisms, but these organs that are formed by these bones serve different functions. This is an example of homology. So you have the bones humerus, radioulna, carpals, and phalanges in these different extremities or forelimbs of different animals, like that of humans, horse, bat, porpoises, and frogs. As you can see, you have the same pattern of the bones, but the functions that they serve are different. That of the humans, the forelimb is for grasping and manipulating objects. For the horse, it's for locomotion or for strutting. And then for the bat, it's for flight. For purposes, for porpoises, it's for swimming. And for the frogs, it's for jumping. So you have different functions, but the same structures. So you have homology here. Uh, According to Darwin's theory of common descent, the structures that are homologous represent characteristics inherited with some modification from a corresponding feature in a common ancestor. Since nested hierarchical structure of homologies is so pervasive in most living groups, it forms the basis of systematic classification, which we now are able to group different organisms into genera, and the genera can be grouped into families, and the families can be grouped into orders, etc. and etc. Because of these nested hierarchical structure of homologies, which is shared by those organisms of the same groups. The German zoologist Ernst Haeckel proposed that each successive stage in the development of an individual, which we call ontogeny, represented one of the adult forms that occurred in its evolutionary history, which we call as phylogeny. This was known as the recapitulation law, which states that ontogeny recapitulates or repeats phylogeny. The 19th century embryologist Carl von Baer, however, gave a more satisfactory explanation of this relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny. He argued that the early developmental features were simply more widely shared among the different animals in the group than later ones were. Another major statement of Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory is the multiplication of species. In evolution, you always have multiplication of species, or what we call speciation. And it is the variation within the species that allows for speciation. Darwin's theory postulates that genetic variation present within a species, especially variation that occurs between geographically separated populations, provide the material from which new species arise. And there are three modes by which speciation can occur. One is by allopatric speciation. The allopatric speciation is brought about by geographic separation of species. The separated populations allows them to evolve independently and adapt to their respective environments, generating reproductive barriers between them as a result of their separation and their separate evolutionary paths. Then you also have sympatric speciation, which involves different individuals within the species become specialized for occupying different components of their environment, such as the sculpin fishes in Lake Baikal of Russia. These are products of speciation that occurred within a single lake. By seeking and using very specific habitats in a single geographic area, these different populations achieve sufficient physical and adaptive separation to evolve reproductive barriers. Then you also have parapatric speciation. In parapatric speciation, geographically continuous ancestral species evolves within its range of borderline across which populations evolve species-level differences while maintaining geographic contact along the border. And then you have adaptive speciation or adaptive radiation, which occurs when many disparate species arise within a short interval of geologic time, a few million years, as shown here by the finches of the Galapagos Islands. They are from the same ancestor, but they have evolved with different beaks to adapt to different food and source of food. Some are uh, fruit eating, some are ground, uh, what is seeds that are found on the grounds. They feed on that. Some feed on insects. So they have radiated to different species from the same ancestor. According to Darwin's evolutionary theory, evolution occurs in a very gradual manner. Evolutionary uh, changes occur very, very slowly, and that these changes ultimately accumulate in the population, leading to qualitative change. There's a form of gradualism called populational gradualism that occurs when new traits become established in a small part of the population and then increases into a larger fraction of the population until it becomes a majority in the population. That's populational change or populational gradualism. Then there's also phenotypic gradualism, which occurs when strikingly different traits from ancestral ones are produced in a series of small incremental steps accumulating over hundreds to thousands of years or generations. Not all phenotypic changes, however, are small incremental ones. Some mutations that appear during artificial breeding change the phenotype substantially in a single bound or in a single mutational step. Such mutations traditionally are called sports. Sports that produce dwarfing are observed in many species including humans, dogs, and sheep, and have been used by animal breeders to achieve desired results, such as shown here by the dwarf or miniaturized Doberman pinschers and miniaturized Dalmatian. Now, on another note, Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould proposed the punctuated equilibrium in 1972 to explain the discontinuous evolutionary changes observed throughout geologic time. Punctuated equilibrium states that phenotypic evolution is concentrated in a relatively brief event of branching speciation, followed by a much longer intervals of morphological evolutionary stasis or status quo. Speciation is an episodic event according to this theory and having a duration of approximately 10,000 to 100,000 years. Natural selection is a major process by which evolution occurs according to Darwin's theory of evolution. Natural selection gives us an explanation for the origins of adaptation, including all developmental, behavioral, anatomical, and physiological attributes that enhance an organism's ability to use environmental resources in order to survive and reproduce. Natural selection may be considered in two components, as random component and a non-random component. The production of variation among organisms is the random component, because nobody can influence which receives these variations among the population. The non-random component, on the other hand, is the survival of the organisms with differing traits. That's the non-random component. In the process of variation, some of the members of the population will be selected or adapted to survive in its environment. So that's the non-random component. This differential survival is determined by the effectiveness of different traits in permitting the possessors of such traits to use environmental resources to survive and reproduce. Darwin developed his theory of natural selection as a series of 5 observations and 3 inferences drawn from them. This is shown here in this figure. The first observation by Charles Darwin was that organisms have great potential fertility, which permits exponential growth of the population. He drew this from Thomas Malthus's idea of population. And then the second observation is that natural populations normally do not increase exponentially, but remain fairly constant in size. The inference that can be drawn from this is that there is a struggle for existence among organisms in a population. Third observation is that natural resources in the environment are limited. His source of idea was that of Thomas Malthus. But because of this limitation of natural resources, natural populations usually experience a struggle for existence because of this limited resources. And then the fourth observation is that variation occurs among organisms within population. His source of this idea was that of animal breeding and systematics. And then his fifth observation was that variation is heritable, an idea which he drew from animal breeding. The inferences to this various observation led him to the second inference, in which varying organisms show differential survival and reproduction, favoring adaptations or other advantageous traits, which leads to natural selection. And the third inference is that in natural selection, acting over many generations, gradually produces new adaptations and new species. So these were his observations and inferences that he drew from these observations that led him to the idea of natural selection. Now, the idea that evolution leads to adaptation has actually been frequently challenged by many scientists over the years. Several hypotheses holds that variation leads to changes that is not always adaptive, such as the case of the Irish elk, which grew over large antlers that is purported to have gone extinct. Such challenging hypotheses about the uh, failure of evolution to lead to adaptation are categorically called orthogenesis hypothesis. Orthogenesis hypothesis, and it it contends with natural selection in that evolutionary changes do not always lead to adaptation. However, genetic research on the nature of variation has rejected these genetic predictions of orthogenesis. Now, a phenomenon that's called as exaptation refers to the utilization of an organ or body structure for a function that was not part of its evolutionary origin. A very good example of this is the feather of birds. Birds today are considered to be descendants of dinosaurs. Among the fossil remains, there are indeed even dinosaurs that have feathers during the Jurassic period. It is believed that the feathers in these dinosaurs were really for body insulation and the thermoregulation of their eggs. But in later evolutionary events, the feathers became accessory for flight, such as in the birds. So here you have exaptation of feather, whereas it was for thermoregulation before in the dinosaurs. But today, in the descendants of dinosaurs, which are the birds, feathers are used for flight. Exaptation differs from adaptation. To be clear on this, adaptations are structures that arose by natural selection for a particular biological role, such as the feathers, which was evolved in the dinosaurs for thermoregulation. Birds' feathers are therefore adaptations for thermoregulation. That is in the dinosaurs. But today, they are exaptations in the birds for flight. The most serious weakness of Darwin's theory was his failure to identify correctly the mechanism of how adaptive traits were passed on from one generation to another. In short, he failed to explain the heredity component of his evolutionary theory. In fact, Darwin saw heredity as a blending phenomenon in which the hereditary factors of parents combined together in their offspring. Darwin also invoked the Lamarckian hypothesis of inheritance of acquired traits that is now debunked. Darwin's theory of evolution provided a selection mechanism for evolution, but it did not provide the mechanism of transferring the traits. And so, the theory had to undergo upgrades after Darwin. The term neo-Darwinism marks the separation of Darwin's evolution theory from Lamarck's theory, based on the impossibility of prior transmission of traits via the germ cells. The German zoologist August Weismann refuted this and subsequently disproved Lamarck's theory on evolution. Please read the paper which I posted recently during Weismann's commemoration of his 100th death anniversary. Neo-Darwinism also marks the combination of natural selection and genetics, as has been variously modified since it was first proposed. Mendelian genetics eventually um, clarify the particulate inheritance that Darwin's theory of natural selection required. The synthetic theory of evolution is a comprehensive theory that emerged through the combined works of population genetics, paleontology, biogeography, embryology, systematics, and animal behavior in a Darwinian framework. Microevolution is the study of genetic change occurring within natural populations. Occurrence of different allelic forms of a gene in a population is called polymorphism. All alleles of all genes possessed by members of a population collectively form the gene pool that a population has. In Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is actually a mathematical statement, the frequency of each allele in the gene pool will remain constant unless acted upon by other agents. This Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium indicates whether or not a population will undergo evolution or not at all. Macroevolution refers to the evolution and speciation of whole populations or taxon of organisms. There are major forces that lead to evolutionary change. You have recurring mutations. These are gene mutations that occur repeatedly, which is the ultimate source of variability in all populations. But it usually requires interaction with one or more of the other factors to cause a noteworthy change in allelic frequencies. Genetic drift, which comes in two forms, bottleneck effect and founder effect. Change in the gene pool of a population due to chance, which can alter allele frequencies in a population, leads to genetic drift. Bottleneck effect is when an event that drastically reduces the population size, whereas founder effect results from the migration and colonization of a small group of the population to a new location, which often limits the gene pool among the population. That in turn affects how the genes are exchanged or transferred among their offsprings. The movement of individuals or gametes between populations can result from migration, which is also known as gene flow. Natural selection results to an accumulation of traits that adapts a population to its environment. Subdivision of a species geographically into small populations that exchange migrants is an optimal situation for promoting rapid adaptive evolution of species. Interaction of genetic drift and selection in different populations permits many different genetic combinations of many polymorphic genes to be tested against natural selection. The image shown here is that of cheetah. They are one of the animal groups that have highly reduced genetic variation because of their being driven to extinction. Only a few of them are left in the wild. So with this small polymorphism of their genes or gene variation, they are on the brink of extinction. For your group assignment number 5, please differentiate between the following: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation, between Lamarckism and Darwinism, between Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, between trends and sports in evolution, between homology and analogy, between ontogeny and phylogeny, between exaptation and adaptation, between phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Thanks.